Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to this first RAI film event of this new season, this new academic year. Thank you for joining us. It's good to see so many of you. So my name is Caterina Sartori. I am one of the film officers here at the RAI. And some of you will know us through the film festival, which we run every 2 years. But in between film festivals, we also organize year-round events on visual and sensory anthropology. And so today we're very happy to welcome our guests, Isaac Marrero-Guillamón and Etiraj Gabriel Dattatreyan, who will be speaking about multimodal anthropology in a talk entitled Multimodal Inventions. So I will briefly introduce the speakers and then I will hand over to them. Gabriel and Isaac will speak for about an hour, 55 minutes. Then we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back for a Q&A or a more open conversation with you in the audience. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. So Etiraj Gabriel Dattatreyan is a senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Goldsmiths, University of London. His audiovisual and written work engages with the ways in which digital media consumption, production, and circulation shape understandings of migration, gender, race, and urban space. His recent book, the globally familiar Digital Hip Hop, Masculinity, and Urban Space in Delhi, published by Duke University Press 2020, narrates the story of Delhi's young working class and migrant men as they productively refashion themselves and their city through their online and offline aesthetic practices. Isaac Marrero-Guillamón has been a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Goldsmiths and is now joining the Department of Anthropology at the University of Barcelona. His work is broadly concerned with the entanglements between politics and aesthetics, and he explores this ethnographically, focusing on conflicts and controversies in which diverse forms of activism and aesthetic practice produce a rupture in a given state of affairs, and new conditions of possibility, participation, and expertise are enacted. His latest publication is an article entitled More Than a Mountain, The Contentious Multiplicity of Tindaya, published in the GRAI just a few months back. And I believe Isaac will be saying more about the project where this article originated from in his conversation. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Gabriel and Isaac now.
Thank you, Katerina. And welcome everyone. We're going to try to keep it quite conversational. So we'll be kind of going back and forth between the two of us. First, we want to share some of the backstage, as it were, of the piece that we wrote, where we kind of laid out some of the questions that we've been working with in relation to multimodal anthropology. And then we'll kind of try to move on from it to kind of more current work and kind of new questions that have emerged in our work, in our discussions following from that work. So that's kind of the plan. And please feel free to use the chat as we go along as well, and let us know if there's any kind of reactions or points for clarification or anything like that. So yeah, in that spirit of kind of constant back and forth, I'm going to pass it on to Gabriel to start.
Thanks, Isaac, and thank all of you for coming today. It's really, really amazing to see so many people in one of these virtual events. As Isaac was saying just before we got started, we've been out of practice with teaching. It's been a long summer, so this is a nice moment to kind of re-engage, I suppose, and think with folks. So thanks again for coming. So I want to start by just, as Isaac said, giving a bit of the backstage or backstory to how we arrived at some of the arguments we presented in that, I believe, 2019-20 piece for American anthropologists. So both Isaac and I have worked in the Department of Anthropology at Goldsmiths for several years together. So we both have coincided for about 5 years now. in the department. And one of our early kind of connections or threads that linked the two of us was our dissatisfaction with visual anthropology as it's constituted as a subdiscipline. And so by that, I mean, we were kind of engaging and looking at the canon, so to speak, the canon of visual work in our teaching and in, as inspiration for our own research projects, and found that that we were having to look elsewhere for new directions and inspiration towards our own projects. So the visual canon, as it were, was not speaking to us in the way that felt energizing or emergent. And so the two of us over coffees, over afternoon or evening chats, post say a department symposium or a department talk, would chat about various things we were reading, various things we were thinking with our own projects, and started to kind of think about what we might say regarding what multimodality had to offer. And it was around this time, I think, so this was, I would say, around roughly 2015, 2016, that several things were happening, right? So the multimodal section in the American Anthropologist was roughly around that time inaugurated. The conversation around multimodality had been growing since 2011, 12, in large part because of the efforts of several scholars straddling the Canadian, the US, and the European academies. And so multimodality for us was an entry point or a gateway for us to begin to kind of coalesce some very specific ideas about what the concept could offer, what was and continues to be called a visual anthropology.
And one particular event where and when we started to perhaps kind of elaborate a bit more these ideas was precisely the 2017 RAI Film Festival. I had put together a panel in that festival called Reclaiming Fiction, which was kind of attempting to kind of highlight the tradition, if we can call it that, of ethnofiction within anthropology as a kind of rich and inventive type of engagement with the world that went beyond representing it. That was more in the kind of in the mode of enacting new realities through collaborative processes, right? And I think perhaps the juxtaposition of that panel, those ideas with some of the work that was screened at that festival, produced some of the early conversations that kind of triggered our, I guess, our interest and our intention in kind of turning all that informal sort of chat and kind of still kind of informed ideas into a text. So what was interesting about the writing of the text, we're not going to go into detail of the writing of the text itself, but it was that we brought quite singular trajectories of thought and of theory, indeed, into the piece. And I think they coalesced around ideas of inventiveness, around the desire to move beyond representation as a dominant paradigm, visual anthropology, but also very importantly around an interest in reshuffling relations of power in anthropological fieldwork through collaborative practice. So the line that went from ethnofiction to something much larger, which had to do with perhaps trying to affect a little bit the field that we had found ourselves teaching in, happened around that time. I'll just say a couple of words of one of the traditions that in my case was quite important, and then I'll pass it on to Gabriel to elaborate on some of the ideas that he brought it, because it's really the kind of the meeting point between these different traditions that created the piece, and we wanted to highlight that. So, invention, it's thanks to kind of the work of Roy Wagner, it's quite a central category in anthropology. But actually, the way we were thinking about invention, in particular, I was thinking about it, came from a completely different genealogy, which is the work of science and technology scholars, STS scholars. And the relationship and the overlap between STS and anthropology is a rich sort of field. It's very interesting. And that was really my connection to anthropology, was through STS. So it kind of made sense to start to put two and two together and thinking about how, if within STS, invention is kind of praised as a mode of engagement designed to experiment with the otherwise, right? With that which is not yet, with the what if, with the what may be or may become. And the work of Lurie on inventive methods, for example, was one of the references that I had worked with. What would happen if those discussions were, I suppose, put in contact with these other traditions within visual anthropology, such as ethnofiction, and try to elaborate perhaps some of the conceptual, theoretical, and political potential attached to that, not just as a kind of an oddity in the field, but as something that perhaps had the power to make us rethink anthropological or visual anthropological practice at large. So that was one of the trajectories that ended up being central to the piece. And Gabriel?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the other trajectory, and the trajectory that I was bringing in, was something that had preceded my time in, in the discipline of anthropology and even in the university, and that was my work prior to the university for 10 years doing popular education work in communities in the US, mainly, but then also in India, and using Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal's methods for dialogic engagement and co-learning. And so for me, these kinds of interventions were kind of at the heart of what I was hoping to do in the university and how I was imagining research to begin with. And so, these were kind of kernels of thought that I had held on to for many years, and I started to kind of think with when I was in graduate school and with my peers there, trying to develop ways we could engage in the communities that we were living in. So I went to graduate school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. And I was very lucky to have advisors and a cohort of fellow graduate students who were really, up for and ready to think about doing work before the field work started, as it were, right? And so one thought we had and we were trying to develop was how we might use our interest in making, right, in making films and producing all manner of audiovisual material to kind of engage different community organizations that were adjacent to our large university campus in ways that were meaningful and productive. And so that kind of married those opportunities that emerged out of that initiative, all under the banner of CAMERA, which still exists at the University of Pennsylvania. So the organization that essentially my cohort mates and I started has been now in existence for 10 years, holds a regular media festival called the Screening Scholarship Media Festival, and continues to engage with the greater Philadelphia area and making together. So these kinds of practice and education kind of grounded approaches, and then coupled with some of the things I was reading and thinking about just as I was finishing up my field work and trying to kind of think through and grapple with some of the things I was doing in India within the Black radical tradition, right? So texts that kind of flagged the imagination as a way to think out of coloniality, right? That flagged speculative practice, and that in its most recent iteration has flagged study or collective study. And here I'm thinking of Fred Moten's work, where what I brought to the table when Isaac and I started to kind of sit down and think together about what it was we were trying to say, what kind of intervention we were trying to make based on the work we'd been doing and the thinking that we'd been doing and the relationships we'd been building, that could be useful, meaningful for folks, right, who were also thinking about different ways of doing ethnography, and perhaps were also dissatisfied with the inheritance, right, that we were getting within the discipline.
Yeah, so I would say that there is something interesting about it. It's a piece unlike anything else that I've written. And I think it's because it was truly dialogical in its process. It was about learning from each other. It was about learning from our trajectories, but it was also about learning from our interactions in the classroom that were happening every week. So I see it really as an inscription of these multiple ways of learning, and the kind of the will to try and learn some of that. So to try to share some of that with others, right? Hoping that it would be useful. And I think that there's a couple of points, perhaps, that Gabriel can elaborate on how these kind of ideas of invention also relate to the kind of social dynamics that we were working with, or some of the attributes of social life as we were conceptualizing it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're pointing me to kind of some of the major interventions, right? The key interventions we were trying to think through. So the first intervention I think that was really important for us is something that Isaac's already raised, and that's, the question perhaps of how do we move beyond representation, right? If we take very seriously the idea emerging out of various intellectual epistemological traditions that the world is not a static, right, object, and that it's always created through interaction, through improvisational interaction, right, but is always subject to various historical dynamics, right? That reintroduce categories, that reintroduce frameworks. How do we work with this constantly shifting process, right? How do we start to kind of think about a world that is unfinished and that could potentially go in multiple directions, right? That had multiple trajectories or lines of flight.
Yeah, so one thing that we did sort of enjoy in kind of Roy Wagner's work was the idea that the inventiveness of culture is, of course, something that is continuous, ongoing, and a feature of kind of social cultural life, right? And this is, I think it's important to highlight that, the idea that the kind of invention that we're reclaiming is not only the kind of modes of engagement that perhaps we favor, but it's also a kind of a faculty of social life as we've learned to recognize it. And I think this is where study and collective study really resonated. The idea that there are multiple forms of inventive practice, of even theoretical production that are happening around us, and that perhaps our role is to kind of to learn to partake in those, as opposed to kind of making up new ones, right? So this idea that perhaps invention or inventiveness is a faculty of the fields in which we operate, and certainly not the sole kind of faculty of the anthropologist. That's very important, and I think it relates to our ideas of collaborative methods as an instrument for perhaps striving towards more horizontal or less hierarchical sort of fieldwork relations. And we'll come back to that later, because there's a number of caveats that we want to kind of put on the table. But that recognition was an important aspect of what we wanted to do.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, you know, so this idea that theory is actually everywhere is something that that both Isaac and I felt we were holding on to in terms of the disciplinary remit that we were working within, right? So one thing that anthropology has consistently put forward, at least in in theory, if maybe not in practice, is this idea that we learn, we go somewhere, we engage in field work to learn with others, right? And that the theorization that we come to is something that that is a part of this process of going somewhere to do field work. And so, you know, the Wagnerian formation around invention was something that spoke to us, right? That captivated us. I want to just kind of bring us to our next point, right? Which is, you know, if we kind of start with the idea that the world is not static, the next kind of obvious, perhaps, step there is that knowledge about a world is co-produced, created within a context. Now, again, you know, there's many caveats here. Those caveats have to do with the kind of prefiguration that history produces, right? And, you know, we need to be attentive to those things. But I think for us, we were really trying to think about how making together could actually produce conversations around the limits, right, and possibilities of invention with others.
And perhaps to kind of conclude this more theoretical sort of discussion, also to highlight the idea that we were thinking with a notion of politics, that we were really trying to connect with the question of invention, right? So no politics in the sense of, I don't know, taking part or kind of taking sides in a structure that is already in place, but actually of cultivating and otherwise, of kind of sort of facilitating lines of escape. And this was important. I think this is related to the importance of speculative, inventive methods that we've talked about before, right? Where what we're trying to do is kind of enact new relations rather than kind of represent existing ones. And that also applies to our understanding of political work. Anything to add with regards to that, Gabriel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at our notes here. So we jotted down some notes for us to make sure we hit all the points we wanted to in this talk. So, you know, one of the things about the political that I think we were both very interested in was, on the one hand, you know, the production of knowledge itself is a political, right? It's a political act. And so we were thinking along a couple of different lines with that, right? So one, the ways in which knowledge within the university, within the discipline, is disciplined such that certain forms of knowledge are valued above others, right? So stepping into this conversation around multimodality and recognizing that non-textual forms tend to still, right? Although I think I'd like to think that's shifting and changing, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. But this idea of the kind of textual, the textual hegemon, right? Like that text is ultimately, the kind of prime way that we legitimate knowledge in the university, right? So recognizing that and trying to think with multimodality through that, trying to think about what multimodality in terms of its capacities for collaborative work opens up, and how that might challenge some of these dominant paradigms, right, around knowledge. We're also, we were also really interested in the political in a kind of more located sense, right? So where we go do work, where we go do field work, how we construct our fieldwork interventions, who we engage with, we're able to engage with, the kinds of reciprocities and exchanges that are part and parcel of doing fieldwork. How does multimodality and collaborative invention sit within these spaces, right? How do we start to imagine a more kind of co-constitutive project without imposing this ideal onto folks who maybe don't have time, who don't have energy, who are not interested at all, right? These were some of the questions we were starting to think about, and I think each of us have taken now in interesting ways as we've moved forward with our work and our respective projects.
Yeah, I think we had a note there on pedagogy, but maybe we can come back to that later, Gabriel, because I'm thinking that what you just said connects really well with another point we wanted to raise with you, which is, the connection of multimodality and invention had to do really with trying to amplify and politicize the opportunities that we were identifying in this kind of multimedia, multisensorial condition that we seem to share with the people that we worked with, right? So, if multimodality refers to these multiple kind of media ecologies that constitute sort of the social worlds that we inhabit, right? How do they kind of provide a platform for reconfiguring anthropological practice? And this at multiple levels, right? In terms of the way we do fieldwork, but also the way that we theorize or how we conceive of theory. And this relates to things that we've already said, how the the publics that we envisage, both in terms of our fieldwork, but also when it comes to sharing the work, how we conceive of those, right? The types of knowledge that we value as such, and that we kind of engage with, right? All these things were, I suppose, on the table, based not on a kind of a tech fetishism of thinking, the digital or the multimedia is going to solve all the problems. Not at all, but just really thinking of it as a condition of the social worlds that we inhabit and work with, and as such, an opportunity for different kinds of horizons and arrangements of our own practice, right? And the examples that we're going to be focusing on in the second part of the talk have to do exactly with considering how multimodal strategies may shift the dynamics when it comes to distribution of work, or the kind of the collaborative arrangements and things like that. So yeah, we were joking that multimodality won't save us, certainly not on its own, but it's something that that provides kind of a different set of parameters to work with.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just gonna kind of maybe zoom forward a little bit, right? So as we were writing this piece and we were developing our current projects, which we're going to show and share bits of in just a few minutes. So each of us brought some show and tell with us to kind of talk through how we're working through some of these concerns in our current work. Yeah. But before we get there, I just want to kind of flag a few inspirations for us, inspirations that have kind of helped us continue to think about some of these questions we're raising, and to kind of maybe further refine some of our thinking around some of these questions. So a big one for us has been Miarca Media. And so Miarca Media is based out of Australia, and they recently had a multimodal publication called Phone and Spear. This was a couple of years ago that won a big award, right? The Society for Cultural Anthropology. And I had the pleasure of interfacing with them maybe now, what is it? Is it 2 years ago, for the Distribute conference, to see if they would be willing to kind of put together an experimental keynote for us, right, and for the conference. And so just watching the way that they worked with each other, you know, and this all came through email correspondence with me and with my fellow organizers putting together Distribute, and the kinds of care and thoughtfulness and inventiveness in the way that they were kind of thinking about what a keynote could be, right? What kind of what an intervention, right? In a conversation about distribution might look like from an Indigenous perspective was a huge inspiration for I think for both of us. I mean, Isaac and I both have utilized Miarka's work in our teaching, and certainly have been in conversation about their work. Another Indigenous collective, Caribing, has been in particular inspirational to me as I've been thinking about improvisational techniques for making cinema, which I will show some examples of in just a minute. But really thinking about improvisational theater, borrowing from Augusta Boal, of course, and theater of the oppressed techniques, but also thinking about the work that Caribing has done, right, to kind of use improvisation as a kind of inventive filmmaking technique to open up storytelling, right, to tell stories differently.
I just put in the link to that keynote. That was, I think it's an extraordinary piece, and I recommend everyone watches it. Hugely influential. I've used it every year since it was kind of released with my students, and I think it really, yeah, it really resonated with our interests and really expanded them. And yeah, it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch. I'm wondering, should we go into the examples and then maybe come back and if there are questions about any of the points that we've made, or?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, one thing that the term multimodality offers, I suppose, that it's good is that it doesn't foreground any particular media, but rather the communicative relationship, right? And because visual anthropology has often historically meant non-textual, and that kind of reinforces a binary or a kind of a parcellation, a partition between media and the senses that we're not so interested in. The idea of thinking of multimodality as a kind of multisensorial kind of dimension, I think it's, as Deborah Vidali argues, you know, how people are sensing, feeling, and being in the world with others. I think that attracted us to kind of using or reclaiming the term. And I think we're now going to focus on a couple of examples of from our own work, starting with Gabriel's Desiring Bollywood.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen in just a moment and show you a short segment of a film that I've been working on for the last several years now. So it's been since 2018 that I started developing the filmic components of it, but it actually, the project stretches back to, I suppose, depending on the way I narrate it, stretches back to 2011, 12, 13. And so the film engages with the story of Jason Ola, who is a Nigerian actor who moved to Delhi to start film school and also to enact his dream of acting in Hindi cinema, and found himself in various challenging situations. So the film was originally scripted by Jason Ola and myself, and then later I brought in a third collaborator, Jesse Shipley, who's an anthropologist and a filmmaker as well. And we started to think with this script as a kind of basis for doing a month-long series of theater workshops in India, where we assembled an amateur cast essentially to enact several scenes that we had kind of sketched out in the script, but enact them not, following the script directly, but using the script as kind of a prompt for improvisation. And so I've since doing this workshop in 2018, started to kind of bring together some of the workshop materials with some of the footage that I shot with Jason over the last 8-9 years. And so trying to kind of bridge this more perhaps conventional ethnographic gaze, right, with a much more kind of improvisational scene work focused engagement has been my task over the last I would say the last year and a half, too. So a lot of work in the editing booth. But what I'm going to highlight, I'm going to show you a clip, and what I'm going to highlight are the moments or the scenes that we developed in the artist residency in Pune, India, back in 2018. So without further ado, let me show you these images, and I'll just draw out a couple of things once I've shown you about three or 4 minutes of the film that I'd like to just kind of draw your attention to.
Anything. Are there even any Africans in India? Oh God, protect me. If I can succeed, my family will be proud when I send money home and videos of me in these big films. As the eldest of the family, I'll be able to support all my siblings. I'll buy them a big house in Lagos. I'll buy them all Benz to be flashing around town. I trust in God.
साई मंदिर ना माफिया नगर माफिया नगर दिल्ली साई मंदिर माफिया नगर you know कल्ले क्या बोलता है भाई तू no hindi साई मंदिर ही जाना है माफिया नगर you know no you know okay.
Be careful who you trust. Don't just follow anybody. People may not be who they appear to be. Shine your eyes, oh. I dreamed of you in scenes from Bollywood films. You were cut into dances and banquets and fights, and you're kissing the heroine. In my dreams, you're a Bollywood star, like Amitabh Bachchan, or Salman Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, all the Khans. The black screen fades into the title card, and there's your name, Ola Jason, in giant red letters. There you are, dressed as the handsome hero, with a big mustache, wearing white shirt, open down the chest, and there's a beautiful lady on your arms. If I fail, I will never go back to Nigeria. And it's cold here. Why didn't anybody mention the winter in Delhi? I shouldn't have followed my stepfather and moved here. I should have gone to Mumbai instead. Are there any other Nigerian or African actors in this place who can help me? I make this hustle on my own. Long evenings, sitting in front of the broken screen of my computer, looking at Facebook. I try to meet people who are in the film industry. I go to my classes at the college where I'm learning film. Maybe somebody there will give me a chance to act, to shine, an opportunity. I'm selling these clothes to make a little something, to get the little things that I need. You understand? I go to the INA market. You know this place? There I buy clothes to ship home. Ade, you remember him? He'll sell them for me in Lagos. You always wanted to be an actor. You loved the cinema as a boy. At first it was foreign films, but when Nigerian film exploded, you started to dream. In those days, Lagos had theaters. Some were just broken down VCR and television, tucked in a courtyard with somebody charging a few nairas to watch. But some were majestic open-air affairs where the crowds came dressed to see and be seen. And we would all talk along with the actors. We followed every dramatic move, and we argued and we fell in love, fought alongside our screen heroes. And you wanted to see yourself on the screen.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Ankit.
Okay.
Can I have a photograph with you?
You can see I'm doing something right now, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Do you play cricket?
No, I don't play cricket.
So which game?
I watch sometimes, but I don't play.
Okay.
Yeah.
So which game are you in?
Football. Do you even have to ask? I play football. I watch football. Football is the game. Like everyone loves football. Yeah.
In India, we don't play much football. We are in cricket.
Yeah, I know. I see. I've seen people playing even on the streets. I've seen that a lot. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I have been in Kenya and Namibia once.
Kenya, Namibia, I've heard this. You're like the third Indian telling me about Kenya. Kenya is Kenya, Namibia is Namibia. I'm from Nigeria.
Nigeria.
We are like the giants of Africa.
We worked hard to be an actor in Nollywood, auditions, shady deals, hustling, and of course, talents. You found your way into the movies. You were at home as the love interest, the boyfriend, the two-faced brother. I was so proud.
Okay. So just a couple of things to quickly point out, right? So the cut that you're seeing now is a 12-minute cut of a film that I have various different lengths of at present. And so this is the latest kind of iteration of the film where I've used some of the scenes that I shot in Pune with this ensemble of actors. And I've put it together with this ethnographic footage, right? This more conventional ethnographic footage, I should say. And then I've added a layer of voiceover, right? Where there's an actor who is reading a script that Jason, Jesse, and I wrote that then gets enacted on top, right, of this footage as a way to kind of connect the pieces. So the bit that I want to kind of have you think with are those bits of scenes, right, particularly that last one, but there was also a little fragment of a scene earlier on in the film where, you know, what we did was kind of open up experiences that Jason had narrated as a kind of text for people to work with and understand a very particular kind of encounter through, right? And so there's a piece now that I have circulating, published in American Anthropologist, that kind of talks a little bit about the learning that emerges within this ensemble about race and difference within the context of this post-colonial encounter, right, between India and Africa. And so just that in and of itself, that scene work that we did for that month or so in Pune opens up a whole world of co-learning and engagement and exchange. And then now the task is to try to think about how that fits into this larger story that we've been trying to tell for the last several years. And I'll stop there.
Great. So, okay, so I'll share another example now, quite different in scope. And I would say that the focus here is mostly to do with distribution, the question of how we distribute our work and how we make it public, and also with the relationship between textual visual, audiovisual, sonic sort of outputs, right? So let me share my screen. This is what I want to show you. So my latest project was called Tindaya Variations, and it was about the conflict, the controversy surrounding that mountain that you just saw. Where, long story short, it's a mountain that has indigenous remains. This is in the Canary Islands, Spain. But those remains haven't really been particularly valued by the government. That has instead pushed for the last 20 plus years a monumental public art intervention that would see the mountain kind of half emptied and a massive cube inside it built, right? So I was interested in contrasting notions of what culture, heritage, and of course nature are in this particular conflict, and I made a film about it. But I've also written some journal academic articles about it. But the question of the ways in which our work becomes public has always been something that I kind of worry about. And having a lot of, or some of my work behind paywalls is something that has always kind of dissatisfied me. So this was really an experiment in creating a sort of a controlled and really humble and simple ecology, where perhaps new resonances or new entry points into this body of work could be provided, right? So the idea was to create a companion site for the film and for the articles that I've been writing. And the way this ended up looking is quite, I think it's quite simple. I created kind of a thematic sequence. Here you have the introduction. Then you have kind of different kind of keywords. And for each of those, I created a kind of a juxtaposition between a video, a play but without the sound, a video that is sort of a re-edit of parts of a film, and then 2 layers of text. And here the experiment was to, the experiment here was to kind of write in 2 voices, a voice that was, or that attempts to be non-academic, and one that it's more kind of conceptual or theoretical, right? And yeah, and essentially it's sort of like a series of juxtapositions, where you have the question of, for example, monuments here appears as an entry point. And then I wrote something which hopefully is quite approachable about the controversy. And then the same series of topics was unpacked in a more, academic or theoretical language, right? Including references and stuff like that. And, the academic, this kind of text, the academic one, it's sort of a version, or I should say a variation of the published articles, right? Whereas the other one, it's sort of like an entirely new write-up. And, each of these kind of moments or juxtapositions has to do with the kind of categories that one may develop as you do research and kind of start to kind of compose your material into areas of interest, but that rarely makes it into it's rarely made visible, I think, because it is kind of like the backstage of the production of academic work. So this was also an experiment in kind of navigating my own writing differently and making some of that process of writing, of kind of finding themes, areas of interest, and so on, visible, right? Both visually, right? Through these kind of short videos. They're all between, I think, 2 and 4 minutes. Most of them are around 3. And also textually. And yeah, in the end, once the film, did the festival rounds, I ended up just kind of putting it there for people to watch as well. As I guess most of you know, one of the questions about ethnographic film is how difficult it is, or films that are produced within, academic settings are sometimes hard to access. So I was also kind of experimenting with the idea of making it public. But having said that, I'm under no illusion. Like putting a Vimeo link into a website, it's not just the last word in making things public. It's just a very small intervention, and of course, this would need to circulate in order to be meaningful. And I'm terrible because I never look at numbers or whatever, so I don't know if this has been successful at all in doing that work. Probably it hasn't, but it was part of the experiment in I suppose in thinking about distribution differently, and also I suppose the project being called Tindaya Variations, I wanted really to extend the logic of the variation as much as I could. So the variation is a mechanism that organizes the edit of the film, a bit like musical variations. Each part of a film is a sort of a reorganization of a similar set of elements. And here, those elements are re-edited and reaccompanied or reassembled with these kind of textual short text. So again, it's another variation. It's another way of encountering the work. And I think that's what I wanted to say about it. So we want to end the last few minutes with the question of where we are now. Gabriel? You're muted.
That was bound to happen at least once in this talk. So it was really nice, Isaac, to see you talk through the website because I hadn't seen you do that before. And what it made me think immediately was, and you know, in terms of a connection to the Desiring Bollywood snippet that I showed earlier, are the kinds of transmedial possibilities, right, that thinking with multimodality opens up, right? So a film in the kind of conventional sense lives and is circulated in a very particular way, right? But what if we were to imagine different ways of engaging with the filmic text such that it's partable, right? And that it becomes something that circulates in different ways. And this was something that I very much was thinking about with regards to Desiring Bollywood, and that I mobilized in the article that I wrote for AA as such, right? As a potential to kind of open up frameworks for understanding something at a different kind of level of texture or relief than what would be possible in a kind of singular narrative structure of the film. And so I think it's important to just raise that or make that more explicit, right? That point. The other thing that I think really ties these two pieces together is this question of relationship and relationality. In your case, Isaac, to place, and you know, I think in my case to these unfolding, ongoing relationships with people and places, right? So, you know, invention, I think in some ways allows us to think about the shifting, changing nature of our relations with different places and use multiple media forms to kind of maybe iteratively work through those relationships, offer up something of those relationships, not entirely different in you know, in some ways to the way that social media, and I don't want to over stress this, right? But maybe to just kind of connect it to the always already multimodality that exists out there, that this kind of iterative relationality is something that's happening in the media ecologies around us. So it's something we should certainly be thinking with in our practices and our own work. So I'm just going to just start with the where we are now. So, you know, one place or location that I'm in now is trying to finish this project with Desiring Bollywood. But the other is that I am now the co-editor for American Anthropologist Multimodal section. And so for the last 6 months or so, I've been kind of just getting my head around what it means to edit a journal section, especially one as large as American Anthropologist. And I have this fabulous team that I work with. So Elizabeth Chin is the EIC, the editor-in-chief of the journal. And then I work with Patricia Alvarez Astacio and Arjun Shankar. And we put out a little bit of a manifesto, maybe, I don't know, several months ago, right as we were kind of starting to get our heads in the game, as it were, about what we really wanted to kind of frame this next period of having the privilege to curate, right, and nourish and support multimodal ethnographic anthropological work. What we wanted to kind of frame that period around. And so we put out what we call an ambivalent manifesto around multimodality. So just to kind of go back to, what Isaac said a little bit earlier, while we do see some of the potentials, right, of thinking multimodally and particularly engaging with invention, there is a worrying trend that we've seen in the last couple of years, where, especially in times of pandemic, right, where digital everything has kind of come to dominate our thinking around method, mode of engagement. And so there's several very explicit maybe warnings that we've put out there in terms of kind of thinking with a toolkit approach, as Charles Briggs recently wrote in American Anthropologists. So that's, that was never the point when Isaac and I sat down to write this piece. We weren't trying to think with toolkits or shiny new things. What we were trying to do is think about very carefully these politics that have, that have inured to the ethnographic anthropological project since the inception of the discipline, and to think about ways we can reinstill some of the promise of it, right? And one of the core promises we feel is relationship and relationality, and cultivating that in meaningful ways that are shared in our approaches. So the technology is, the kind of tech side of multimodality is not the point, right? That is the means, perhaps, to realizing some potentialities.
And I think relatedly, we had sort of a question mark, maybe to share with the audience, and we can discuss it in the Q&A if it's of interest, which is whether, for us, multimodal anthropology was one way to unsettle visual anthropology in the way it had been understood, both in terms of the canon it kind of drew from, but also the kind of the heavy media-based self-definition, right? And for the reasons that we discussed before, multimodality or multimodal anthropology was useful to challenge that. But now we've started thinking as well, what does it mean to mark anthropology with a descriptor, such as multimodal, right? To place that as a kind of as a key component in the self-understanding of what we're doing. And we're wondering whether there's something to be said for kind of eventually abandoning that label, and argue that perhaps what we're doing is simply anthropology, and that the need to kind of to point at the multiple modes through which we relate to others, through which we produce relations, through which we engage in knowledge, produce knowledge, value knowledge, recognize knowledge, and so on. Perhaps that's what anthropology should be, and not just kind of multimodal anthropology. So we have this question mark. This is something that the two of us have started to discuss, and I don't think we have an answer yet, but there's something, I think, to be said for building this edifice so that we can destroy it and have something else in its place. So yeah, I don't know if we want to add to that, Gabriel.
I think we can leave it there and maybe pass the mic back to our wonderful organizers. Thank you so much for listening to us for the last hour.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for a lot there.
So we had planned to just take a super quick break, just stretch our legs, whatever, and then come back. Are people okay with that? I haven't been looking at the chat, so I haven't.
I think we can take a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
So we can just switch our cameras off, and we'll be here back in 5 for more engagement.
please do stick around, just and consider this break an access break, right? For those of us who maybe can't sit in front of a screen for so long. Yeah.
So thank you again, both of you, for a very inspiring and rich conversation. So I'd encourage anyone who'd like to ask a question or make a comment to put their hand up. And you're welcome to also unmute yourself and just take the floor, or use the chat box to send us a question, either privately to me or to the speakers or to everyone.
Also, I just want to, yeah.
Yeah, you could.
I just wanted to add that please feel free to kind of also share your own work or work that you know of that resonates with what we've been talking about. I think it's great to see, you know, what other people are up to and to learn from your experiences as well. So, you know, we have a comment from Judith, really interesting, you know, similar discussions are happening also in the field of documentary with regards to, you know, what's the boundary between documentary and interactive documentary and so on. And I think you've made a really good point in the chat. So yeah, if anybody wants to just share some resonances or interest, that'd be great as well.
Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
All right, sure. I was hoping to type this into the chat, but for some reason my cut and paste isn't working, so I guess I'll actually have to speak it out. I want to preface kind of my question just by saying that I love the article and found it very inspiring, especially in the expression it gave to some of my own kind of inchoate feelings about multimodality and my work in it. And I wanted to follow up on something in the article and in the talk today. In both, there seems to be, or there's a kind of clear interest in invention, in part because it's seen as kind of liberatory. It has a liberatory potential, liberation from the text, from things that are static, from oppression. I noted that Gabriel said that, you know, he had an interest in the imagination as a way to escape coloniality. At the same time, there was the notion that multimodality won't save us. And so I'm wondering, is this a tension in your thinking? Is invention, is multimodality always liberatory? If not, then how do we kind of think about that in relationship to yeah, the article and kind of what you're doing? So anyway, that's my question. Thanks.
Do you want me to jump in? So thank you, Andrew. That's an important question and a good point to clarify, right? So I suppose there's a couple ways to answer it. So one way to answer it is around multimodality, and then the other is around invention, right? So with regards to multimodality, right, if we consider multimodality as a kind of engagement with various ways to or various modes to kind of create together, to share moments or moments of encounter that have happened together. And if we kind of tie it to its corollary multisensoriality, right, which is, and I love the way that Deborah Vidali phrases it, something that is always happening, right? We're always sensing the world and sensing the world with others in multiple ways. There is a kind of, you know, hopefulness tied to this kind of formulation, right? Because what it suggests is that we can sense and be together in ways that are otherwise, you know, foreclosed or made very limited based on the kind of strictures and worlds we live in. And that's a potential, right? That's a potential, and it's a hopeful one. But if we, you know, if we think about multimodality simply as a set of tools that can get us there, then we land in trouble, right? So that's what I was suggesting a little bit earlier, that this kind of impulse towards, you know, towards kind of shared liberation or a shift in consciousness, right? That this is something that you know, this is something that you cultivate as a researcher. If we're thinking about research in particular, this is something that you're cultivating and thinking about at various different levels, because of your position in the world, in part because of your commitments politically in the world, right? So for me, these things are not necessarily conjoined, right? But they need to be put in conversation, if that makes sense. Now, with regards to invention, not all inventions lead to any sort of liberation. I mean, we know this. If we follow the life cycle of capitalism, invention is quite the opposite, right? So what does invention offer us? What does it open up? You know, for us, I think the kind of key was to thinking about the small inventions, the reimaginations that are happening every day. I love the way Fred Moten writes about it in the Undercommons, for instance, where he's talking about, you know, study. He doesn't use the word invention, but he's talking about study and theory. And he says, you know, hey, you can walk around a city in any block, on any stoop, in front of any building, and you will find theory making and you know, world making happening, right? So if we think about these small instances of or openings, like what can those openings, if we pay attention to them, if we recognize we're already participating in them, what can they do for us? What can they, like, how can they open up our research imagination in a very different way?
Yeah, I was gonna add to that you know, invention in particular, I think, enables us to kind of think about politics slightly differently, right? Kind of away from what we may describe as the politics of representation, but also really perhaps even in tension with the notion of critique as the fundamental sort of logic of kind of politically oriented work in academia, right? So the idea of work that reveals, that kind of shows that which kind of perhaps ordinary people cannot see, that kind of the politics of expertise that were constructed around that kind of political commitment, I think, is what invention unsettles, because it tells you perhaps there's another register of politics that is happening, as Gabriel said, all around us. And perhaps the invention is a way of thinking about politics that redistributes that kind of relation of expertise, and that kind of like redistributes it. And I think that that's something that we were both interested in, coming from different places, but I think we met there. We have a question in the chat.
So I'll just read it out, so then it might be easier. In the context of inventiveness, you suggested that the ethnographic encounter is co-produced within a context. What is your thinking and or conceptualization of what constitutes knowledge in an inventive encounter? What can we learn through inventive encounters as compared with written or more traditional forms through which ethnographic knowledge gets disseminated?
That's great. That's a lovely question. Isaac, can I take a stab at this? So, okay, so I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but one, you know, particular genre of Twitter writing in academia Twitter is grad students who are, you know, struggling with trying to figure out how to write their chapters, right? And so part of this genre on Twitter is, you know, people who are trying to figure out how to go back to their field notes to be able to kind of extrapolate what happened, how it happened, in order to kind of narrativize that in a chapter, right? This is the conventional way we all work. This is not to put any graduate student in a place, but what's interesting about the kind of the narrative that appears on Twitter is how painful that is, because it's so divorced of the multisensorial shared space in which these encounters happened in the first place, right? So one thing maybe to think about is whether these inventive encounters, these moments that we're having with people, these bristling, you know, maybe even uncomfortable. I like to talk a lot with my students about discomfort, right? So those moments of discomfort in the field, those moments where we're being challenged, where we're being pushed back, what if those moments were the beginning of something, right? That we produced, maybe we had the opportunity to follow through with others, or at the very least follow up on our own. And here, you know, here I'm thinking with this kind of idea of backstage and front stage, which is an Irving Goffman formulation that then gets picked up by anthropology, right? Where we have these front stage encounters that we then narrate through, but then this backstage stuff is left behind. What happens when we put the backstage front stage, right? And then even to take it even further, what happens if we start to think about those moments as moments of reinvention, right? What emerges as knowledge in those moments, in those encounters?
Yeah, I think we may want to think with terms such as kind of, you know, embodied knowledge, for example, as a different kind of experiential knowledge, something that is not easily turned into a theoretical, perhaps, kind of takeaway point, right? And for example, my postdoc was about how artists were repositioning themselves in the context of the Olympics in East London, right? At a time where, you know, their working and living space was changing radically very quickly, right? And I got entangled in multiple kind of collaborations, and precisely because I had that kind of question, or a similar question to the one that you raised in mind, I was really worried that it was derailing. That was the metaphor that I ended up using, that fieldwork was derailing the process of producing knowledge, because I didn't identify any knowledge being produced. I was just doing stuff with them, events, you know, perhaps it would be like a public event or a tour of the neighborhood where we kind of try to kind of unearth some interesting stories. But I didn't recognize that as the kind of knowledge that I have been trained to produce based on fieldwork, right? So I think perhaps there's also an interesting thing here where, you know, collaborative multimodal methods perhaps enable us to kind of rethink the idea of knowledge production as the ultimate horizon of fieldwork or anthropological work. Or perhaps knowledge can't stay, but then perhaps it needs to mean something slightly different, right? Not knowledge in the sense of, you know, theoretical or conceptual work. It could be other types of knowledge, right? I don't know, that was just one example that kind of sprang to mind as I read your question, Aparna. Thank you.
Well, as you were presenting your case studies, your examples, I was really drawn to this the idea that is in the title of Isaac's project, the variation. So the remixing, the juxtaposing, the variations that also came out. Gabriel, you spoke about the various edits that this film is going through that live and exist. So I wonder if you'd want to say something more about that, because it seems that in each iteration or in each variation, different forms of knowledge kind of take center stage or come into relief more than others, and others fall further back. And there's a kind of experimenting with different. I wonder if you want to speak a little more about that aspect.
Can I say something about your project, Gabriel? Because I think it's interesting having encountered it in multiple different sort of arrangements. I think some of that work, I've experienced it as a viewer, right? So I've seen Desiring Bollywood when you were preparing the installation for, I can't remember, SVA conference, I suppose it must have been some years ago. So then I was thinking, okay, these are images that are going to be encountered in a room. So I'm going to be moving between them. And, you know, I took something from them. I've also seen them in the context of an article that is discussing, you know, questions of racialization and discrimination, right? Those same fragments started to mean something very different there. It was the power of, you know, workshopping as a way to work through what you may even call the trauma of that process, right? Of kind of racism. We now watch them in the context of something else, in the context of sharing a process of inventive writing together, right? As a way to kind of navigate somebody's story in the form of a text. So I think, to me, that is the power of the variation, you know? It is a complete opposite of kind of copy pasting. With each arrangement, something changes, you know? And I mean, I always thought of variations from a musical point of view, you know, like, I don't know, you listen to Bach and, you know, you realize, yeah, it's similar, but it's not the same. And the constant and playful kind of rearrangement of the notes in this case kind of produces slightly different kind of harmonies, right? And I think that and you know, more, I don't know, like drone music that seems to be always almost the same, but it's not quite. Those were kind of inspirations for me in terms of thinking what can variation do, right? And I think it can do a lot, you know, like, of course, it's not the answer to anything or to everything at all, but I think it's a useful strategy, you know, precisely because it allows you to kind of to test the effects of, you know, the way you arrange the materials. I mean, same images, but you can rearrange, you can create different ecologies of encounter, and that makes a difference. You know, it's the difference that makes a difference.
That's really nice. I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking, Isaac, about something you raised a little bit earlier around expertise, right? There's something about working through multiple iterations and thinking about different kinds of audiences, which is, you know, one of the early arguments for why I was working in multiple media, right? That I wanted to engage with audiences that that went beyond my anthropological peers, right? My peers in the discipline, or that went beyond the so-called communities that I was working in. But I wanted to engage with different folks in different ways. And you know, there's something about iterations or variations and freeing yourself in some ways. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that I've only realized fully in the last year is how much, you know, we get attached to kind of a finished artifact, or this idea of one, right? That, you know, we're putting out a book, or we're putting out a film or an article, when in fact they're just, you know, way stations in terms of our thinking with others. And, you know, and developing a practice around that. So not just having that recognition, but developing a practice around that, I think allows us to decenter ideas of expert knowledge in ways that are productive, right? In ways that open up the frame, that maybe invite rather than wall off, which is something that I'm really interested in.
I have a question, maybe observation. I'm calling in from Dallas, Texas. And I work, I guess I'm the odd man out here because I don't think other people are performance-based. I am a trained performance artist and director, but many years ago, while teaching at the University of Alaska, I was asked to develop a theater program, Alaska Native theater program. Knowing nothing about it, what I did is I went to villages, talked to elders, etc. And I created a program that was essentially based on the culture. So rather than adopting Western cultural dramaturgy and vocabularies, it's, in a sense, I extrapolated historical vocabularies into a modern context. Because even the Alaska Native people themselves kind of marginalized their own tradition in terms of it being like old school or for ritual and for the old people. And we created a program. And that program evolved and got recognized. And so I got to be invited to numerous indigenous groups throughout the world. And so it's kind of like, I'm a performance ethnographer. I do ethnography, but also, and what interests me in this talk today is the performative aspect, because you mentioned golf, Ben, and there's a lot of performance. And what I'm seeing is, in a sense, and what you're doing with Nigerian and India is very much kind of it's like Roche, what he was doing in his work, very much this performative kind of intervention. I guess my question is how much is too far? Because when I first started doing this work in the late 80s, early 90s, the major objection was not from the indigenous groups that I worked with, but from white anthropologists saying that I was meddling with it, that I was somehow interfering with the purity of it, and I was somehow diminishing, I was a meddler. And now it seems like the tone is adjusting in the world, and now maybe because we're becoming globally in one level indigenous, there's a new kind of like openness to intervention and interaction. So I guess it's a question, it's a comment, it's a concern, it's something that floats in the air in my own work. And I do also ethnography in a pure form. I say quote unquote pure. For the last 5 years, I've been working with the Miao people in Southwest China and documenting rituals that are evaporating very quickly. And now they've asked me to, when the COVID lifts, to go back and actually work with their badais, who are their shaman-like people, and basically create a performance with a group of shamans, a group of badais, something that's never been done before. So in a way, it's kind of like it's more than it's multimodal, but actually it's moving into activism, and I'm just kind of like, I feel alone here in terms of people I can talk to on a theoretical basis, on a ethical basis, to kind of get some insight. So I'm just laying it on you right now.
Thank you so much for sharing some of what you're doing. And yeah, I mean, I think the projects that you're working on are very resonant, particularly the performance-based stuff. I mean, that's a space that I've been thinking in and thinking with for years and years, formally and informally, right? As a participant in theater of the oppressed communities, and then also as someone who's using these techniques and ways of working to kind of learn, right? To learn with others, to unlearn as well with others. So, I mean, I think the question you're posing is, there's a couple of different questions in there, right? So there's a question of pushing the envelope too much or going too far, right? And I suppose the question is, you know, or the core of that, for me at least, what I'm hearing is that there's this sense that somebody out there, and I guess so maybe the question back to you is, who are you pushing too far, or what are you pushing, who are you pushing it too far for, right? You said it's not the indigenous communities, so it's someone else. Research communities, right? Is that what you were suggesting?
And what I find too is many times when I work with groups, these are generally young people, we bring in elders, and I draw from elders, and basically the first phase of the work is to document the vocabulary. Again, rather than adopting a Western vocabulary. It's like you and I learning a foreign language to talk to each other. You know, we have a language already, we should use that. And so what I found is that many of the participants, they actually, because I'm interested, a white male is interested and done his due diligence and research, that they become more interested. Things that they've kind of like, they're urbanized and are more interested in hip hop culture and things of today, and are going, wow, you know, that's interesting. And I'll ask my grandmother, I'll go back to my village, and they kind of re-examine themselves, which is kind of like an interesting, turnaround. I'm kind of an instigator, a provocateur in a sense. So no two projects are alike. I've been hired once years ago with the known Bushmen of the Kalahari to do a tourist show, to bring tourists into this area of the Kalahari, so they could put these Bushmen on who are on a reserve, and so they could go into a cash economy. And so it's like, but the things were so messed up there. I go, we can't do this, it'd be unethical. So I convinced them to do a research project and with them, because none of it had been documented. So every project is kind of different. And the people I'm working for basically depends on what they need. In some countries I go to, I'll work with graduate students because they know their culture, but they do not know how to document it. So they'll go in there and they'll just start taking video, and I go, what's this mean? I go, they'll give their opinion, what they thought. And I go, oh no, how do you know this? Have you talked to these elders and gotten the diversity of opinion to make a conclusion, or at least present the diversity? So a lot of it is kind of wherever I am and whatever's required. So I'm happy to share the methodology, just that with others, because I think there's a demand for it. And no one's kind of working in that area. And I sense you guys are. And that is, I find it encouraging and something I want to embrace. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but generally it's for whatever they need. It's dynamic and it may change depending, you know, I'll work with groups over a period of years.
Yeah, I think maybe a bit tangentially, but I liked where you ended, you know, like, you know, the group is sovereign to decide what's to be done in a particular kind of setting. I think that to me is a good kind of, yeah, beginning of the conversation. And I've been really inspired by work on indigenous futurisms, because it really, you know, shifts the debate, you know, around politics from a kind of a duty of conservation to a cultivation of the radical imagination, right? And this idea of temporal sovereignty, the sovereignty to imagine yourself and your people into the future, which is what, you know, has been traditionally denied of indigenous communities that have been kind of relegated to being something of the past, right? So I think these discussions are really interesting, and we cite some of that work in the article precisely for that reason, because they've activated the question of inventiveness in defense of their positionality, but not as kind of saviors of any particular tradition, but as actually as a kind of an active reclamation of the future. And I think that's an interesting kind of like way of thinking about the questions that you're putting on the table from a slightly kind of different angle.
I'm a practical. I have to be practical when I go into a setting, and it's that's the kind of requirement. And what I'm sensing too is our culture, meaning the broader Western culture, needs to know this information and needs it to be deciphered. And one way to decipher it, I think, efficiently, and what you're doing with the mountain, for instance, in a sense, you're creating an interesting kind of like ritual with that mountain, a ritual understanding of it. But you're doing it from an indigenous perspective, and then you're melding it with your own kind of a non-indigenous Western perspective, Western trained perspective. And in the sense that, because we have globalization in terms of economy and transport and communication, but we don't have it in terms of culture. And that's we're kind of lagging behind. And I feel this kind of work maybe is a step in that direction of understanding that we're all earthlings. They're all part of a larger culture, then we need to be earth conscious. And indigenous groups have been there from the beginning. And it's how do you decipher that, and how do we, people in the academy, decipher that and give that to a broader culture? That's for me the big issue. And what I'm, you know, I want dialogue with peers, and people tell me I'm right and wrong, whatever.
Thanks, Thomas. We have a few other questions in the chat. I wonder, Gabriel and Isaac, if you want to take Juan Ortega's question, which was sent at 5:28.
Yep, I see it. So I'm just going to read it out.
Mm-hmm.
Before you remark the possibility to say that we are doing just anthropology instead of visual anthropology or multimodal anthropology, is it similar to what Sarah Pink argues for sensory ethnography as an ethnography that is done with all of our senses? Is this the turn that you want to propose as well, to think in multimodality as the modality in which we should engage in our ethnographic adventures? Isaac, do you want to jump in, weigh in on this?
I'm not sure I have a good answer. I think in a way, yes, like we are wondering whether these kinds of qualifiers of our work are needed in the end. And certainly, you know, the work, I mean, it's multisensorial, it's multimodal. So I guess in a way, yes, the hope is that it becomes self-evident, that doing fieldwork is not just writing notes and then translating those notes into articles or books. It is kind of an embodied practice. I mean, I think everyone knows that, but somehow like the official presentation of the craft kind of tends to mitigate that aspect of it. So yeah, I think if you think about it, like when you communicate with people, when you kind of develop relationships, those relationships are necessarily multimodal. You're communicating visually, textually, through language, through gestures, and so on. And that's the nature of relationality.
Okay, I'll just add, I haven't read Sarah Pink's, that particular text in a long while, but I do remember thinking and feeling as I read it that while the kind of core premise was something that I agreed with, that there wasn't as much of a development around or a conversation, you know, and I'm in no way saying that we've fully developed this conversation in the piece that you've read or that we shared with you, but certainly we've flagged some of our concerns around, which is the question around the politics, right, of the sensorial. So, you know, I just, you know, I would say the caveat, I would say, yes, generally, I would agree with this idea of this turn towards the senses, and yeah, the idea that, you know, we engage with all of our senses, and we break, maybe we break away from a kind of logocentric way of thinking about knowledge production. But the caveat there would be, right, to think about the constitutive forces that produce the encounter in the first place, the limits, the kind of framings, right, that history produces, lest we get into the space where we're kind of like, yeah, I'm going to go out there, right, and just feel with all my senses with the people that I encounter in the field. So there's a danger to that, right? There's a danger to that narrative. So we have to be quite careful about what we're saying in the context in which we work and who we're working with. That'd be my little addition.
Thank you, Gabriel. That's a really interesting and difficult question about stability and instability in the chat. And I think, yeah, I hesitate to go into it, but I would say that in my experience, it varies a lot from project to project. So I'm not in a position to provide a general answer. I think because I've studied conflicts that involve forced displacement, you know, there is sometimes a desire of stability in the sense of being able to maintain your livelihood and your home. In other circumstances, the desire is to be able to move and to travel and to not be subject to forced immobility. So I think this is such a, yeah, it's very context dependent. So I think it'd be nice to kind of delve into that in the context of a particular kind of research project. And I guess if you're tapping into how do we, the relationship between our collaborators' own kind of theoretical understandings and our own, that's a really rich discussion, because sometimes there is kind of a synchrony or kind of a very easy sort of agreement, and sometimes there isn't. And I think the role of this agreement is very, it's interesting because it's difficult, because most of us, at least the people that I've spoken about this, we tend to avoid kind of unpacking those kind of like discrepancies publicly, because it feels like a bit of a perhaps a betrayal or something that doesn't need to be shared with others. So I think it's really interesting to kind of consider what happens when our understanding of a particular kind of situation differs with people that we have strong working relationships, right? How do we host those disagreements in ways that do not sabotage the possibility of the relationship, but also that don't kind of fall into the trap of thinking that only consensus is that only through consensus is possible to have a kind of a working relationship with collaborators. So, yeah, but it's hard to go into any kind of detail if you don't want to kind of open up these kind of black boxes of the research experience.
Yeah, I would concur that this question of stability, instability is very context and relationship dependent. I would add one thing, and that is when I think about this dialectic of stability, instability, I immediately think about temporality, right? So there's something about incommensurability or incommensurability about the temporalities that we bring with us or that we encounter or that we adjust to, that I think has everything to do with this question of stability and instability. And I'll maybe illustrate that a little bit in with a story, right? So there's a young man who I've known now for many years who I met in Delhi, but he was only there for a period. So he had lived in another Indian city for many years prior to moving to Delhi. He was there as a refugee in India, and he eventually got asylum in Finland. And so I went to spend some time with him in Finland, and he invited me to stay with him in his apartment, right? So I was with him in his apartment, and he was off school. So we just had all of this time. So he's like, hey, why don't we do something? Let's do something together. I was like, all right, let's do something together. What do you want to do? And he's like, well, let's film this crazy town I'm in, because it's a really, it's a really interesting place. I'll show you around, right? So I found that project of making together, again, doing this walk, him showing me some of the things he wanted to show me about the town, opened up a temporality partially connected to his status in the country, but also very much connected to his age, right? So he was in his early 20s, I'm in my 40s, that there was this clash of an understanding of time, right? Like simple things like when you eat, right? Like he could go till 6 p.m. and not eat. And that was partly a function of money and resources, right? Like he saved eating for one meal a day because he didn't have the resources. It was also partially a factor. It was also influenced by his age, that he was able to do that. I found myself struggling within that kind of structured stability, right, that he had created for himself. So I suppose I'm raising this story. It's not a complete answer, it's not very well formulated, but just thinking about how temporality works, right, to produce variable stabilities and instabilities within our encounters is probably, a good place to kind of think with and start.
Well, thank you both. This is the moment. If you have any more questions or comments, come forth. Otherwise, I would say that we should thank Gabriel and Isaac very warmly for a very inspiring and very thoughtful contribution. We did record this, so we're going to make it available at some point in the near future on our website. So if you want to sign up for the RAI's mailing list, you'll get a heads up there when it will be live. So thank you again, and be well.
Thank you all for coming.
And everyone.
Katerina for hosting, and Steve and the rest of the team. Thank you all.